Hello, my name is Adam Barlow, and this is my presentation on metacognition in the theories of teaching and learning class. So, metacognition is pretty cool. It's a fundamental part of learning. And just a couple of questions I hope that we can answer today is, first, what is metacognition? Why is it essential for learning? And how can it be used in your classroom? So I hope that those three takeaways we hit those. So we've got these 4 points we're going to go over: the historical foundations, the fundamental tenets, teaching implications, and some critiques or some pros and cons to the theory. So first, historical foundations. If we go way back, this isn't technically metacognition, but it's very similar. So we've got this quote from Confucius and Socrates. So Confucius said, "What you know, you know. What you don't know, you don't know. This is true wisdom." So simply an awareness that there's things you do know and things you don't know, and being aware of that state of mind. Socrates also advocated for knowing thyself, which is a process of becoming self-aware. Another one, a little more contemporary: it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So it's a good quote from Mark Twain, just that sometimes our own knowledge that we think is correct isn't right, and we act on it in ways that gets us into that can become problematic. So being able to regulate and be self-critical of, in a positive way, of your own thinking. So this theory is formalized and was first given a name by John Flavel. So he was a professor at Stanford in 1979, and he came up with this the term. He was the first to use the term metacognition. And his interest was particularly in studying children and their cognitive abilities. One experiment or study he did was seeing how how children could remember certain patterns and rearrange them in like blocks, like here's a block pattern, and then have them recreate it. And you notice that students who were older generally did better than the younger ones, and they were often, for what he has observed, is that they were better at regulating their own memory, their own cognitive experiences. So you've probably heard that metacognition is, quote, thinking about thinking, which is a common way to think about it. It's mostly accurate, but there are some inaccuracies involved in that. It's incomplete on its own. So the fundamental tenets of metacognition include two major aspects. First is an awareness of one's cognitive processes or metacognitive knowledge, and then regulation or control of cognitive processes, metacognitive control. So, and you can break that down even further into different facets of what knowledge is. So Flavel also identified that there's declarative knowledge, so that's kind of the knowing what, procedural knowledge, knowing how, and then conditional knowledge, knowing when or why certain information might be important and how to use it, I suppose. So metacognition also has two major branches. You've got your knowledge and your regulation side. So on the knowledge side of metacognition, you've got knowledge of persons, including yourself, knowledge of tasks, so that's kind of the procedural, like how to do things, and the knowledge of strategy, so understanding how to use and apply strategy. Metacognitive regulation includes the ability to plan, to monitor, to evaluate, and to control your own thinking and your own tasks. So, number 3, teaching implications. We've all heard this quote: give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And that's unknown. I guess it's fairly disputed, or it's pretty well debated about who actually said that first. But the principle applies very well to teaching, that we teach students to kind of be self-sufficient learners. So, and here's another quote: so give a student the answers and they complete an assignment. Teach a student to take control of their learning and you create a lifelong learner. And that's by myself. I just made that up. So just to kind of summarize the idea. And another quote by Ron Swanson: so give a man a fish and feed him for a day. Don't teach a man to fish and feed yourself. He's a grown man and fishing's not that hard. So this one's funny. I love this quote and I love that show. But it does reveal a little bit of truth about some pitfalls we might fall into as teachers. Sometimes we just assume students they know how to, quote, fish already, when really they need to be taught pretty explicitly how to maintain or how to monitor their own learning habits and cognition. So here's a quick video about metacognition.
I think incorporating metacognitive strategies in our classroom teaching is extremely important because we want students to implement metacognitive strategies in their study time and learning time outside of the classroom. And so they have to experience the impact of these strategies when they're inside. And so, of course, metacognition is just your ability to think about your own thinking, to analyze what you're doing. And I think the way we can implement that in the classroom is have students, when we are presenting new material, new concepts, not just focus on the what, the facts, but have students reflect on why should this be true, having them look at relationships between bits of information, actually having them think of analogies in everyday life that relate to the new information they're using, and even having them analyze and write down what specific learning strategies are you going to apply between now and the first test, or between the first test and the second test. What kinds of questions did you miss on the first test, and why did you miss those questions? If you were teaching this class, what kinds of strategies do you think you would employ that would be more successful in helping you understand this information? So the more of those things we can do in class, the more we're helping students transition from being passive learners who want to come to class and sit and have us pour information into their heads, transition them into active learners who are engaged in the process, who know how to significantly impact their own learning.
Okay, so I really like that video, especially that last little bit there, that we're essentially helping students become active learners who are responsible for their own learning. So as we think about this as well, what are some learning strategies that you have used in the past that work for you? And you can think about things that you did like for a spelling test, or things you're currently doing as with your graduate studies. Here's a few strategies that this video highlights.
Recent research has demonstrated that effective learning involves planning and goal setting, continual monitoring of one's progress by identifying what you know and working on what you don't know, and then adapting as necessary, all of which are part of metacognition. The benefits of metacognition come from using strategies like self-questioning, annotated drawings, concept mapping, checklists, and reciprocal teaching, to name a few.
So that video is pretty quirky, but it's pretty well, it's packed. It's from the Smithsonian, and it explains it really well. I've got that video linked here at the end of the slideshow. Thing. So some metacognitive learning strategies, just to name a few. You've got mnemonics, such as rhymes, patterns, and connections between words. Reflection, so taking time to reflect and recall what you've learned. Creating goals to set determined or self-determined goals about your own learning. To think aloud, to verbalize your thoughts. Self-assess, to check in on your own learning. And organizers, graphic organizers, or written organizers. So here's an example from my life. So I remember countless hours my mom drilling me for the Friday spelling test in elementary school, and one that I still remember and I still say every time I write out I use the word friends. I remember mom saying, fries are friends till the end. So fry and friends. And that's just always stuck. And I never used the I before E rule on that one. I just always knew that it was fry ends. Another one, I had a professor at BYU when we were memorizing different equations. One of them was power is equal to current over voltage. And to remember, P is equal to C or over I for induction divided by voltage. He'd always say, pigs in Venus. And he'd say in that goofy voice. And it made no sense. It was out of context, but I never forgot it. And it was kind of a dumb thing, but I still use it. Here's one when I was learning Portuguese. I served an Elias mission in Mozambique, and we learned Portuguese there. Random, but something that fascinated me was that all words that ended in EMA, like an Emma, are masculine, even though A is generally a feminine, would have a feminine article. So, and the same applies to Spanish. So the word the problem is actually u problema, even though it ends in an A, you start with L or U, depending on Portuguese or Spanish. So, and I would just remember Emma's a guy, and we don't know why. So that was just this dumb little rhyme that I used. Okay, and then self-assess. This probably feels very applicable, but while reading, skilled readers check their progress. So you take, this is straight from our textbook, you check your own progress periodically, make sure you're understanding. Thinking aloud. So I've got a teacher friend here at my school who has a rubber duck on his desk. And whenever a student has a question, he has them ask the rubber duck first. And the idea is not that the duck's going to give them the answers, but just the process of verbalizing their thoughts, usually, more often than not, leads them to the right answer. So it's kind of a fun one. Graphic organizers, this will feel familiar as well. We're doing that in this class. This is also a learning strategy. Venn diagrams, bubble, topical organizers, hierarchical, topical organizers, and just basic outlines, all of those are examples as well. So theory critiques. Some pros and some cons. So some major pros is that it's widely accepted and there's a lot of supporting evidence. It's very applicable. It's easy to see the benefits, and also it's easy to implement into your own classroom and your own learning. And it does help promote responsible and independent learning and lifelong learning. So it's a skill that benefits just learning in general for all people, or for throughout all of life. Some cons. Some variation between learners, tasks, and strategies. One strategy may not work for someone else. It's also difficult to separate this theory from the theory of self-regulation, as it's so similar. And it is subject to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which means you're overconfident, or essentially you don't self-assess very well. So you may think you're doing better than you actually are. And sometimes it can be distractive. Sometimes these can be a little bit over the top. Sometimes these strategies aren't actually necessary, and they can actually end up taking more time away from learning than had you not used them at all. So here's a little bit of bonus material, some follow-up questions. So let's consider these situations, and here's metacognition in action number 1. So scenario, Aiden, one of your students, seems overly nervous about getting the right answers. He asks a lot of questions, and even though he's likely capable of solving them on his own. So what metacognitive strategy could you use to help Aiden become more of an independent learner? So give you a second, kind of think about that and how you might address that problem. And however you chose to address it, it could involve any number of strategies. One, you might use the duck, where it's like, hey, maybe try asking this duck the question first. Or how could you set some goals or organize your thoughts a little bit better on your own before coming to the teacher? Not that your questions aren't appreciated, but and also expressing that you want to help Aiden learn on his own. Metacognition action number 2. So here's a scenario. You're assigning a large multi-day project. From past experience, you're worried your students will procrastinate and miss the deadline. What metacognitive strategy could you use to help your students complete the project on schedule? So I think most of us have probably had this experience where we've given them weeks or days to work on a project, and they've had plenty of time, but then they get to the deadline and they're not ready. So what are some strategies, metacognitive strategies, that could help prevent procrastination? All right, and whatever answer it's probably something like with goal setting, having them draw out a timeline, like by this time I must have these things taken care of. Maybe have them reflect periodically, like check in at the beginning of each class, and have them reflect their progress and try and infer how far they'll get if they continue at that same pace. Then metacognition number 3. So your scenario is you're a CTE PhD student at Utah State and have a lot of reading each week. Sound familiar? So although you do all the reading, you struggle to remember what you've read. what are some metacognitive strategies you could use to help remember what you've read. So one that I know I like to do is I'll highlight, just simply highlighting passages I've read help me. I'll also take time after I've read to just kind of reflect, okay, what does this mean? A powerful one as well is if I made a test question out of this, what would it look like? So there's a lot of different ways you could do that. And then essential questions revisited. So I hope throughout this video, you've been able to understand what metacognition is, why it's essential in learning, and some strategies you can use in your own classroom. So thank you for listening, and good luck with class and your own metacognition. So thanks.